personally believe
elitism,
Marxism,
atheist, government intervention,
secular humanist,
liberals and conservatives,
materialism,
nihilism,
U.S. Americans,
Christian,
globalist,
socialist,
democracy.
Worldview, as the word suggests, is how we look at the world around us. How do we understand life as it hits us in the face?
Libertarian,
Tea Partier,
the free market.
Nobody is without a worldview. The only question is it a good one or a bad one?
So it becomes the glasses, the spectacles, the filter through which they're actually seeing life. And the whole universe and the world and human life is understood through that lens.
This is Steve Deace.
And we're back on a Worldview Wednesday here, powered by the USA Radio Network, with your college philosophy class on the radio. And if you want to respond to anything you're going to hear during this or any other hour of the show, we love to let you do that via the stevedeace.com inbox. You can email us, steve@stevedeace.com. That's DEACE. You can also follow us on Twitter at Steve Deace Show. Like us on our new Facebook page, facebook.com/Steve Deace. This week we begin a new multi-week series. This is part one. The title of this Worldview Wednesday series is For Such a Time as This, and we're going to let you listen in to a class that I am teaching at my home church here in Des Moines, Iowa, where my family attends, talking about the importance of this upcoming presidential election as it relates to both the Iowa caucuses, but also to all of us that are conservative activists and believe in American exceptionalism nationwide. Here's part one.
What is a biblical role of government? Is there one? Is this a subject that the Bible is silent on? Do politics and religion, do they mix? When you take a look at where we're at as a culture, we're going to talk about that over the course of the next few weeks. We're going to lay that out for you. We'll also talk about the candidates. What are some skill sets that we are looking for? The first thing we have to do, the very first week, is we have to establish a premise. So let's begin there. There are really two worldviews. When you boil it all down, there's a lot of isms, belief systems that compete with a biblical worldview. But Dr. Dobson once made the point, there's really only two worldviews in the world, now and ever. God is, and He ain't. Or God said, or He didn't. That's pretty much it. All other isms that we derive come from those two premises. Right? So the divisions we see, for example, in a biblical worldview begin with the premise of God is. And then we debate what God actually is. On the other side, in the unbelieving world, it all comes from the premise that God ain't, or God didn't say. And then it's a matter of what we say and who we are instead. It is very similar when you look at the political arena. I know we get distracted by terms: libertarian, conservative, liberal, moderate, Republican, Democrat, independent, third party. What do all these various things mean? In reality, most of them mean nothing. A lot of times, we in the media where I work apply labels simply to make it more convenient to put people in boxes, to position people, to define them, so right away your arguments either are taken seriously or are dismissed, depending on what box we choose to put you in. You may think the most influential power I have in my job is the communication of opinions and persuasion. I wish that were the case. I wish I could get more people to think like me. The world would be so much a better place. Or at least my world. I don't know about the world. My world would be in a much better place. But the reality is the most influential power we in the media have is not the communication of ideas. It's deciding who gets to determine those ideas. It's deciding that Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton is going to speak for every black person in America. Or we're going to say we're going to pick the craziest, most senile people, and they're going to speak for every white evangelical in America, so that we can define all of you. There was a professor named Overton at Hillsdale College had a theory. And this theory became known as the Overton window. And the theory is, assume this whiteboard here is a window, and that elites on both sides decide what information, what spokespeople get through this very limited window. They decide. And everything outside of the Overton window is radical, crazy, can't be tolerated. This isn't some harmless little game. These folks are well aware of the influence that they peddle. They are actively trying to change your minds. But it is not through the communication of ideas, it is through access to the platform. Because if certain people are not given access, that isolates all of you. And it makes all of you believe no one else thinks the way that you do. Even though a lot of people think the way that you do. They're just at home watching this as well, thinking no one else thinks the way that I do. That is the game. Now the beauty of this is here in Iowa, we get to blow this game up, and that's why they hate us. We don't have a major television population center in our state. We have one market that's a fringe top 100 television market. You actually have to meet people here. You have to sit down in a room with 10 or 15 pastors, none of whom have a church larger than our own. And you got to win them over, and you got to have that meeting like 300 times in 6 months. The system hates that. They don't want to have to do that. And so what often happens is the media comes here, not just on the Republican side, but the Democratic side as well. They come here believing they know what the narrative is, who the front runners are. And they tell you it almost never works out that way here. And then they call you a bunch of yokels. They try to make it look like you guys don't know what you're talking about, because they don't want you to have the influence that you have. And that includes the people you think are on your own side. They want all the authority and influence concentrated in the 202 and 212 area codes. And I can promise you, when you're in those area codes, and unfortunately I've had to be there a lot the last few years, you don't exist. You just don't exist, and they just don't care. It is quite likely this will be the last chance you'll have in this process to have the influence you're about to wield the next 7 or 8 months. They've tried to take it away from you the last couple of times. This time, the people running the Republican Party are mismanaging it so badly, they will probably do it. So I would urge you, on top of what's happening in the culture, and if you haven't gotten the signal from the Republican Party, they want to banish evangelicals to the kiddie table, you're just not paying attention. As Todd Starnes says, one of my favorites at Fox News likes to say, they want your vote, but not your values. So to me, to use a poker terminology, if you're watching on TV, this is the degree all-in moment. This is the moment where you put all your chips in. This is the big play now. You're going all in. Because you're likely never going to get this kind of influence if you live in this state ever again. And there are going to be people listening to this on the radio that live in other states. Maybe if they live in South Carolina, I would say the exact same thing to them. The demographics in South Carolina are very similar to Iowa. A lot of evangelicals, not a lot of major television markets. I don't think they have really any there. So it's all retail politics there as well. They don't want you to have a say. They want to control the say. They want control of the Overton window. This may be our last chance to smash it and let other people through. And we've done that on both sides. I know they like to say, well, it's just these crazy evangelicals in Iowa. You're right, because it was the crazy evangelicals in Iowa 8 years ago who looked at Hillary Clinton and said, why would we want a Democrat corporatist when we get a true progressive like Barack Obama, and went with him instead and upset the entire Democrat political establishment? I'm sure that was all those crazy evangelicals that did that. No, it's people on the other side of the aisle that decided they wanted to think for themselves too. They don't want anybody thinking for themselves. They want to think for you. Well, this is your last opportunity to think for yourself. Or it may be if you don't.
We will continue for such a time as this on part 1 of our new series here on Worldview Wednesday. Next.
You're listening to Steve Deace.
I like you.
From the front lines of the battle for liberty, the Steve Deace Show.
Continuing part 1 of our new series here on Worldview Wednesday that will last over the next few weeks. For such a time as this, why this particular presidential election is so important, what's at stake, and what we can do about it.
So the first thing we've got to know, therefore, is really, when you boil it down, there are only 2 views of government. Only 2. The first is the progressive view. And this is the viewpoint that you see aired almost everywhere, including in your own places, many of your own publications, many of your own media that you watch, several of your own talk radio shows you listen to are communicating variants of this view. Because a lot of us believe progressive means liberal, and that is not what it means. In fact, the very first ever national candidate for office who was a progressive was a Republican named Teddy Roosevelt. He didn't like the fact the current President Taft was too conservative. So he came out of retirement, formed a third party called the Bull Moose Party. Some of you may even live in towns which have Bull Moose clubs. And most of the time, these Bull Moose clubs are going to be downtown where a bunch of the wealthier Republicans will meet, because they're progressives too. And so Teddy Roosevelt formed this Bull Moose Club, or this Bull Moose Party, challenged Taft as a third party candidate, helped elect 100% statist progressive by the name of Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States. And today, Woodrow Wilson is usually looked at as the founder of modern progressivism. But actually, Teddy Roosevelt was the first national candidate for office that was a progressive. And so you have to understand that you're not dealing with, I wish it was as simple. I know some of you, I look around the room, there's a lot of older faces in this room. And you're going to come out of an era where you were the moral majority. And the lines were clearly drawn in your minds, at least. And certain evangelical leaders came out and used certain phrases that were like dog whistles, and that was your cue. Empty out of the pews and go to the polls. And then Republicans won. We saved the republic for at least another 2, 4, 6 years. Back to the church potluck. Oh, if only that were true. Instead, you've been used to elect several progressives. Last name Bush mean anything to you? All progressives. There are different progressives, just like there's different Christians. Not every Lutheran means the same thing, believes the same thing. A Missouri Synod Lutheran is going to believe a few things a little bit different than an ELCA Lutheran will, right? And a Free Methodist might mean something completely different than a United Methodist. And an American or General Baptist might mean something a heck of a lot different than a Southern Baptist, right? Same thing with progressives. They're not always of the left. Progressivism begins with one truth. Human nature is good. Human nature is good. They are Pelagians. Pelagius was a heretic several hundred years ago that taught human nature is basically good. Here's a problem with that. How does sin enter the world? The enemy looks at Adam and Eve and says, "Ye be like God, knowing good from evil." You are basically good. Sin enters the world. Now none of us are good. Right? All of us are born into sin. So right away, this is a repudiation of what you hold, many of you have sitting in your laps, right from the very outset. If you really want to get the window to the soul of a candidate for office, whether they're running for dog catcher or leader of the free world, ask him, is human nature basically good? Now, human nature's potential is good. We have the potential to do tremendous good because we are the imago Dei. We are made in the image of God. And as Christ points out, no one is good but whom? God. No one is good but God. And we are made in His image. So we have great, vast potential to do good. But are we, in our nature, are we basically good? No. Even the good that we do will often be for our own selfish motivations. I want this girl to notice me, or this boy to notice me. I want this peer group to give me an award. I want to win this game so I can win more money, get this promotion. Who's the operative word there? I or me. So we are not basically good. This is the opening premise of all progressives. Human nature is basically good. This is why George W. Bush at his second inaugural address gets up and he draws a moral equivalency between Moses and the stone tablets at Mount Sinai, Christ and the Sermon on the Mount, and Muhammad receiving the Quran. And says things like, all human beings want to be free. We heard that a lot during the George W. Bush years, did we not? All human beings may want to be free, but not in the way he means. Human nature says all human beings, and if you think I'm wrong, pick any era. I'll tell you what. I'll take 6,000 years of recorded human history. Take one instance that proves to me I'm wrong. Answer, you won't be able to. There's a reason why we've been a republic for about 240 years, which is a speck of dust of history. And we're the longest sustained experiment in human freedom. Why? Because how fallen human nature defines freedom and how the Word of God defines freedom, just a bit outside. Fallen human nature wants the freedom to get over on my fellow man, to take that which belongs to you, to rule over you, to claim you. That is what human nature says we call free. The freedom to impose my will upon you. That's a little bit different. How many eras of sustained freedom have there been in the 1,500-year history of Islam? How many? No, it's a really low number. Think. 0. Zip. Zilch. Nada. So no, all people don't want to be free. All religions are not basically the same. Human nature is not basically good. This is the thing you have to get. This one right here. Because what has happened is the progressives have taken over all of your government schools. And they have replaced discipline and justice with self-esteem. Put the emphasis entirely on the self. Because this is the linchpin to progressivism every bit as much as human beings are all sinners. None are good. All are fallen. None would choose Him. That's why we need a Savior. Without that, there's no reason for Christ to go to the cross, right? This is the genesis of their salvation story. That human nature is basically good, therefore it can progress. And we can get on the right side of history and make things even better. That we can build a utopian-based society. When our founders wanted to create a society where you had equal opportunity, that was revolutionary enough. These people actually believe you can create equal outcomes. Equal outcomes. Picking the winners and losers. Maybe you've heard some of that language in the last few years. This company's too big to fail. It's called a bailout when Democrats do it. It's called economic development when the Republicans do. And that's because the government can step in. Someone has to ultimately be the arbiter. Someone has to be the referee. So who's going to step in and decide which direction to utopia? If human nature is basically good, then we don't need who? God. Then we have to decide ourselves, what's the next most powerful force on earth after God? The state. Government. Here's the problem, though, that progressivism always runs into. And we saw this just a couple weeks ago. We took our kids to see the movie Tomorrowland, an homage to progressivism. But here's the problem. They build this world of tomorrow, and these elites are going to go there and figure stuff out in a quiet place, for we plebeians are not in the way with what befalls us as mere mortals. So they can decide what's best for humanity. But lo and behold, when they go away, what happens to them? They become corrupted and end up destroying their own Tomorrowland. And so I'm waiting as we're watching this movie, I'm waiting for this movie to understand its own plot. Right? The great irony of this movie is, it's like if I was writing a polemic about progressivism, it would be Tomorrowland. It completely, unintentionally shows you the flaw in progressivism, which is whatever body you determine will determine what's best for the rest of us. Those people bring the same sinfulness of humanity into that meeting room with them, no matter how many degrees they have, how many accomplishments they have, how much money they've made. They are every bit the sinner as everybody else, and they can't escape their own sin. They bring that into the process as well. They forget that, though. So the big solution at the end of the movie is, we'll just hit Control-Alt-Delete, and we'll go get new progressives, and we'll do it all over again. Right? You ever ask a progressive, when do we know we've cured hunger? When do we know we've cured poverty? When do we know we've cured racial injustice? They can't give you an answer. And then you ask them, how much more money do we spend? How many more years do we do this? How many more failures must we document? And they'll say, well, I guess we just need more money. Smarter pagans this time. Figure it out differently. It cannot work. Here's what you need to understand about progressivism. It's not that it won't work, and maybe this new time will get even smarter pagans and put them in public office and make it work. It cannot work. It runs contrary to the way the Lord God Almighty made the world. And He still makes the rain fall on the just and the unjust alike. He still reigns. He still rules.
We will continue for such a time as this on part 1 of our new series here on Worldview Wednesday. Why this could very well be the most important election of our lifetimes, for real this time. More in a moment.
You're listening to Steve Deace.
I like you.
Compromise isn't a virtue. This is Steve Deace.
Continuing this Worldview Wednesday, we've heard all our lives is the most important election of our lives. This time it's actually true, I believe. And we're doing a series this summer here on Worldview Wednesday explaining why. This is part 1 of For Such a Time as This.
Here's what you need to understand about progressivism. It's not that it won't work. It cannot work. So it's not a question of it won't work because these people aren't good. Barack Obama's not an amateur. He's not an idiot. He's one of the most successful presidents we've ever had. You just don't understand his agenda. We'll get into that, though. It can't work. No scheme of man can prevail against God. You didn't make that car. So just because gas is expensive and you want it to run on windshield wiper fluid instead, you can pour all the windshield wiper fluid in the gas tank you want. Car won't work on that. It wasn't made by its maker to do that. Neither was this planet. So government programs don't fail because they're inefficient. That's the Fox News lame-o answer. That's not the right answer. The answer is they can't work because you're asking government to go outside the jurisdiction of its divinely appointed sphere of influence. It cannot work. Government is not God. No matter how many tanks it builds, won't work because it can't work. So they begin with human nature is basically good, therefore they have a utopian vision of society. Now there are different kinds of progressives. The one in the White House is a Marxist or a statist. What does that mean? It means he believes, and the people around him believe, human nature is basically good and the state is the vehicle by which to drive human progress. All other entities should be accountable to the state. That includes your family, your church, your education, You didn't build that. Your business. Everything. It is in the state in whom we live and breathe. This is not new, actually. It's new to us. But this is the debate Christianity has always had. From the very beginning. When they put a sign over Christ at the cross, what did it say? What did it say? King of the Jews. So the religious leaders took Jesus to Pontius Pilate and said, we have no king but Caesar. Now we understand that Christ was crucified for the sins of the world. But in the mind of Pontius Pilate, and the mind of the Roman authority, he was crucified for sedition. Claiming to rule these subjects of Rome when Rome has only one king, and the religious leaders that sent Christ to the cross agreed, we have no king but Caesar. This has been the challenge from the very beginning. Because all governments want to be God. All governments do. Even in your Old Testament, you hear kings that are called Baal-something. Baal means what? Lord. All governments want to be God. There's never been a government on earth that neither proclaimed it wasn't God or that its power didn't come from God. Never. Even our government, it claims your power comes from God. That your rights come from God, or at least it used to claim that. All right? So every government wants to be in control. The problem is you have the Christians who stand up and say, I can't do that. You're asking me to do something I cannot do. There was a famous bishop in Smyrna named Polycarp. Even the pagans loved him. And there was a great crackdown persecution by the Caesar at the time of the Christian religion. And they went to Polycarp, I believe he was about 86 years old, and the Roman soldiers, they went to him and they said, we really don't want to have to do this. Just this once, bow the knee, say Kaiser Kyrios. Caesar is Lord. Just do it once. We'll even let you do it in private. Let us go back to Caesar and report that you did this just this one time. We don't want to have to do this to you. You've been a good man. Polycarp said, how, all these years, these 80 some odd years, my Lord has been faithful to me. How can I at the end be unfaithful to him? And so these Roman soldiers, because they were from the tolerant society and they believed in diversity, said, you know what, we'll go back and say to Caesar, you got to make an exception. No, that's not what they did. They burned him alive. They burned him alive. Same debate we're having today. Is it Kaiser Kyrios, or is it what Polycarp said? Christos Kyrios. Jesus is Lord. That I will give Caesar all he requires of me, except the one thing he wants the most. My total undying allegiance. I will give Caesar my taxes. I will give Caesar my military service. I may even give Caesar my property. But the one thing I will not give Caesar is really what he wants more than anything else. My undying allegiance. And that is the same thing progressive Marxist statists want from you today. So yes, Hobby Lobby, you will change your religious views. And yes, Christian counselor, you will change your religious views if you want to be certified. And yes, Christian baker or florist, you will be driven from business. If you will not comply, then you will be made to care. The other kind of progressive we see is what we see in the other party. This is the corporatist. And many of your elections, frankly, are just these two camps having a family feud. That's what most of your presidential elections have been since about 1988. In fact, they've all been this since 1988. These two factions having a family feud. They're just arguing over who gets the money. The corporatist progressive also believes human nature is basically good. Doesn't want to have to listen to God either. These are the people you guys vote for. And really all they want to make sure is that the corporations, the private sector, public-private partnerships. Now, when Mussolini did it, we called that fascism. Now we call that being an establishment Republican in the 21st century. Public-private partnerships like Common Core, where Republican governors get together with Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. The elites, the progressives get together and say, you guys just don't know how to raise your kids and educate them right, so we need to do that for you now. Really, all these guys, the only difference is they don't want the state to be supreme, but they want the state involved. They'll give you a race to the top and No Child Left Behind, which is what led to Common Core. They'll give you Medicare Part D, which is what led to Obamacare. I mean, for goodness sakes, guys, many of us in this room, we're crawling over broken glass to get a guy elected president who came up with Obama's worst idea before he had it. Literally 7 billion people on planet Earth, only one other person can say they signed into law the worst piece of legislation in a terrible presidency, and that's the guy we decided, boy, the world would end if this guy's not president. Stop and think about that for a second. Now that we're a few years away from that, can we all just, as believers, take a deep breath in a church and recognize how utterly foolish that would sound if we weren't actually directly involved in it? But that's what we did. And we've done it the last few times. McCain, the Bushes, all these people are Teddy Roosevelt corporatist progressives. Human nature is basically good, and we can use the state to make it even better. We just don't want the state to be the ultimate and supreme. We want other public entities to feel like they have a say as well. And this is why, if you've ever been involved in Republican Party politics on an intimate level for more than 12 minutes, you'll realize that the people who run this party hate you more than they hate the guys on the other party. And this is why. Because you guys are having a fundamental worldview debate with them. The other guys are just debating who gets the money. Mike Ronstall and Terry Branstad here are the top two politicians in Iowa. The only debate they have is who gets the money. Does the money go to unions and the Democratic interest, or does the money go to corporations and my interests? Do we give a couple $100 million in subsidies and tax breaks from Microsoft to build something over there off of I-35 that might give us a few hundred jobs? Or do we just literally hand it to AFSCME in a blank bulk check and say, hey, split it up amongst yourselves? That is the debate. And as a result, we like to brag this is a right-of-center country. That's true. But the center has moved to the left. What has happened is the base of the Republican Party is way over here to the right. It's more conservative and libertarian now than it's probably ever been. A lot of that a reaction to what you've seen Obama do. The problem is you're led by people that are way over here, to the middle. So they drag you over here with them because a little bit of yeast ruins the whole batch. Yeast from the who? Pharisees. Who are they symbolic of? The leaders. We can have the most faithful church right here we want. If we go upstairs when we're done and find out Pastor Bob has been engaged in an illicit affair for years that we did not know about, what's going to happen to this church? It's done. Because he's the leader. It's always about the leadership. It's never about the base. The other party is the exact opposite. Most people in the Democratic Party are about right here, to the left of center. They just think government ought to do for people what they can't do for themselves. They're not Marxists. But you know who runs the party? The Marxists, who are way over here. And so they take that union drywaller that you grow up with and your kids play youth football with, they take him and his family to the left with them because they're the leadership. This isn't an election. This is not an election. Elections are about big ideas and big values. When Ronald Reagan stands up there against Jimmy Carter, everybody knows where everybody stands, right? One way or the other, agree or disagree, you don't walk out. They had one presidential debate in 1980. I think everybody that watched, all 100 million people that watched, all knew where these two guys stood, one way or the other. Do you know that when you watch many of the debates now? No. Why? Because they have the same premise. They're only debating the application. Same premise, debating the application.
More of our Worldview Wednesday series, part 1 of For Such a Time as This, why this election is, for real, the most important one of our lifetimes and what we can do about it, continues in a moment.
You're listening to Steve Deace.
I like you.
Truth and nothing but the truth. So help us God. The Steve Deace Show.
Back here on a Worldview Wednesday, we conclude part 1 of For Such a Time as This about the 2016 election, but not just the general election, even more importantly, the Republican presidential primary.
Now over here is a completely different viewpoint. There is a God. This is the American view. And it's very clear, if you've studied real American history for all of a nanosecond, who they thought was God alone. The God of the Bible is the only God. Our rights come from Him. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable, meaning pre-existing, natural, cannot be taken away, born with, inherent, that's what that word means, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Rights come from God, do not come from government. Want to know why the Magna Carta failed? They had liberty by law. King John guaranteed the liberty by law. But as we learn in the Bible, some days arise as pharaohs who know not Joseph. Amen? And what happens when there's a pharaoh who knows not Joseph? Slavery. I don't remember all of that. So we had liberty by nature. The laws of nature and nature's God. This is the way God made the world. This was His intent. And only from our sinfulness does this not happen. So liberty is by nature. There is a natural law. C.S. Lewis once observed, all cultures pretty much had the same moral code with a few exceptions, which is indicative of the fact we're all made in the image of the same Creator. We all know it's wrong to murder and steal from our neighbor, and to murder our neighbor. We know that. So this is where our rights come from, not from government, which means government is accountable to the same God of equal standing as is the people. Government by the consent of the governed. Radical idea. And that the only role of government is to protect and defend those God-given rights. Notice I did not say establish. Notice I did not say define or create. If a human institution has to define, create, or establish something, it's not unalienable. Unalienable means it pre-existed all of these arrangements. And your Constitution, which is the longest lasting civic document in the history of the human species, has a radical paradigm shift. Instead of clearly defining the freedoms of the people, it limits the jurisdiction of the state. That's never been done before in human history and hasn't been successfully done since. And the reason why, others have tried to emulate it. The French have tried emulating this. I think they're on their 20th Constitution. The French had the power to the people, peasant uprising. And what they did after they got rid of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI is they killed all the clergy. They de-Christianized France. They purged the church because they thought human nature is basically good. We should just rule ourselves. They wanted anarchy. And it led to what was called the Reign of Terror. Here we established a simple premise. This is the William Penn line. It's been attributed to many other people. If men were angels, they wouldn't need government. Men are not angels. We're not basically good. You have to understand our founding fathers come from a pre-Darwinian indoctrination era. So in our era, what we debate is how good is human nature. In their era, what they debated is how intimately sovereign and involved is God in creation. There were deists, there were theists. What's a deist believe? Well, that God created the heavens and the earth, but is basically a kid with an anthill. He just is a passive observer. He sits by with a magnifying glass and watches us scurry about. But no one debated that human nature was basically good. They didn't even consider that it was. Out of the Reformation, hundreds of years of Catholics and Protestants murdering each other, they had no question. They didn't even bother debating with themselves, is human nature basically good? They didn't believe that. So their debate was how intimately involved in our affairs is God. They understood that God created the world with 4 spheres of influence. And this is a primary teaching that comes out of the Protestant Reformation. You have to understand, during the time of the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church and the state had almost melded into one. So the original idea of a separation of church and state actually came out of the Reformation, John Knox, one of the great reformers. And that was done in order to protect the church from the state, not the state from the church. And there were 4 spheres: the self, the family, the church, and the state. Catholicism pre-Reformation taught, because of Augustine, there were only 2 spheres, the city of man and the city of God, and they had some overlap. The Protestant Reformation said, no, there are 4, and there is no overlap. They are all distinct: self, family, church, state. And the line is thick. And as the great prophets said in the movie Ghostbusters, don't cross the streams. All right? The line is thick. But here's the key. All are accountable to God. There is no sphere that is not accountable to God at all times. All spheres are distinct, have their own jurisdictions and authorities. But all are accountable to God. That no one can tell you what to do unless what you want to do imposes on somebody else's will or God-given rights. Then you're in violation of God, and it is government's role to do something about that. Let's go to Romans 13 here really quick, starting in verse 3. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God, an avenger, who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. The purpose of the state is to punish evil. It serves no other purpose. Punishing evil. And it punishes evil to protect your God-given rights from people who decide they want to live in defiance to God so they get to steal your stuff or harm your loved ones. And the state sends in the police to punish them and sends them to prison when they're found guilty. The family has its own jurisdiction, the procreation of the species, the defining of gender roles. It is the primary educational conduit. It's the primary discipleship model because it's the oldest government in God's created order is the family. The church, if the state is for the punishing of evil, the church is for the transformation of the people. The church has to define what is good and evil. The state cannot know on its own. Cannot know on its own. The church defines that. And then the church takes people who would be sinners or have even acted out as sinners and tries to transform them into saints. And the church does that by administering compassion, the preaching and teaching of the Word. These are clearly defined spheres, but they're all underneath the jurisdiction of God. If we violate this, there is no smart person that can save us. There is no middle way. Now, as someone who's lost 100 pounds, I understand when you put on a bunch of weight, you don't lose it all in three minutes, right? But if we don't start working our way back to this paradigm, we're lost. So here's what you're looking for. Someone or someones who understand this, who can use the power of the bully pulpit through the presidency, which is the most powerful bully pulpit in the world, to begin moving the center that's gone over here the last 25 years, to begin moving it this way. That's what you're looking for. Into back to right alignment, where we start moving back to these spheres of authority, putting things back in their place, because what we have right now is just one sphere, and it's all the state.
We'll have some closing thoughts on what you just heard, part one of For Such a Time as This, here on A Worldview Wednesday next.
You're listening to Steve Deace.
I like you.
No sellouts, no surrender. Steve Deace.
So, Rebecca, your thoughts on what you just heard, part one of For Such a Time as This, the series we're doing here this summer on Worldview Wednesday, talking about this presidential primary, why it's so important, what's at stake, and what we can do about it.
That it's so important to get back to the basics. We fall for artificial distinctions that we're given as truth, that we've been miseducated on purpose for such a long time that when we get back to the basics of our founding, we say, yes, this makes sense. Yes, government is designed by God to control this specific sphere, and the family has its specific sphere, and the church and the individual, and all of these things are designed to work a certain way. That all makes sense with a believer's worldview. So why is it that we conduct ourselves in the world that is so different to that, when, especially in a country when we're supposed to be the ones in control, when we're supposed to be the ones that get the say in how our government works? How is it that our government is now working us instead of the other way around? And I think it's important for us to remember that, especially now, as you pointed out, that we have perhaps our last opportunity to have such an impact.
Over the course of the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about the process itself. We're going to be looking specifically at the candidates. What are some skill sets that we are looking for, and some of the key issues involved in this particular election cycle as well. So hopefully you're going to get a lot out of this. If nothing else, well, we killed off another hour of airtime. And we'll kill off another hour here in a moment when we come back.
You're listening to Steve Deace.
I like you.